I've been trying to understand what it actually means to be professional and think professional and become a professional in this rather complex field of working with young children, families and communities in very diverse social-cultural contexts. So while most of my work is at the moment in international context, so we're looking at these questions in very different countries, like for instance several European countries, the UK, Germany, Belgium, the Scandinavian countries, but also rather different contexts, for instance early childhood programs in West Africa, where things are easily very different to what we take for granted as being normal in early childhood in our middle-class urban environments that we're used to.
The concept of robust care is something that came out of my own doctoral work, and I think that's a really important contribution to theorising communities of practice and community leadership. Robust care moves the discourse of care on from that thing that you do for somebody else, that caring for somebody, into a domain where it's care in relationships of interdependence. So moving on from dependence to interdependence. Joan Tronto is the theorist, she works in Canada, that invented this very rich concept. And she has provided a definition of care as everything we do to take care of ourselves and to take care of our world. And she's broken her concept into caring about, taking care of, caring for, and taking care of self. And I think they're really useful ways of expanding our own understandings of care in a field that's often called care, but doesn't always address the multidimensionality of care. So that's a useful theory that I think we can take up a little more in our discourses around care and education, that very unfortunate dichotomy in the work that we do.
The theorist I'm focusing on today is Michel Foucault. I used his work for my thesis, which looked at how early childhood teachers perceive regulation to impact on their provision of quality education and care. And I found his work really, really useful. I know some people are hesitant about Foucault and sort of think, oh no, he's a bit out there. But I found that rather than him opening up things and leaving you with nothing, he actually gave me some powerful tools to critique the regulatory environment, which I'd like to share with you in this segment. And I'm going to do that by running through 3 key quotes from Foucault's work and just outlining a bit as to what they mean for me and how they might impact or help you think about the regulatory environment differently. And I'm focusing on the regulatory environment because that's been the focus of my work, and I think it's a really significant time with the National Quality Framework coming in for you as educators to think about how to think about and how to engage with that sort of regulatory framework. The first point from Foucault's work that I'd like to talk about, and which I think is why his work is helpful, is that he challenges, well, he certainly challenged me to think outside the square. So I'm just going to read a quote out for you. He says, "A critique does not consist in saying that things aren't good the way they are. It consists in seeing on what type of assumptions, of familiar notions, of established, unexamined ways of thinking the accepted practices are based. To do criticism is to make harder those acts which are now too easy." So for me, that line of thinking is helpful because it's about saying, okay, we have a regulatory environment, we have national quality standards coming in, how are we going to engage with that? You will hear lots of positive messages from the Labor government, from people in bureaucracies about how positive the regulatory environment and the national quality standards are. And there's no doubt that the regulatory environment offer positives for children and for educators. But where I'm coming from is to think and to use Foucault's work to help us think about how we might critique them, what assumptions underpin them. And I think it makes more complex how educators can use the regulatory environment as a means of improving quality practice. When I first started doing my doctoral work, a lot of feedback I was getting from educators was how disempowering the regulatory environment was. It was so constraining in terms of paperwork. It limited teachers' autonomy. It limited teachers' practical wisdom and exercising of judgment. Teachers had done 4 years of study, ongoing professional development, and yet they felt that they were hampered in the extent to which they could exercise that knowledge and their expertise. So what I think Foucault does is give us some tools about how we can critique the regulatory environment in a positive way, not in a way where we just go, the regulatory environment is bad, that's it and let's just have a whinge. He actually gives us some tools to think about how we might engage with it constructively. Foucault also says, my point is not that everything is bad, but that everything is dangerous. And I love that quote because I think sometimes when you question, you can be labelled as you're just a downer, or you're so negative, or you're a whinger. Okay, and that's not what this is about. And it's, again, I want to emphasise the point that it's not to critique regulation is not to say that regulation is bad. But just as with anything, regulation can be dangerous. And it relates to, you know, the saying, your greatest strength is your greatest weakness. Everything has a dangerous side to it.
When I started working in this field in early childhood, I was a practitioner, and there was many years ago in a community development project in Germany. I had no idea about early childhood education. I had no formal qualification whatsoever. I got involved in this project because I needed money to finance my studies at university. And I was asked by a group of male-only social workers if I would be interested in setting up an early childhood program with refugee families and Roma communities in a community development project. So when I started, for me it was completely normal to see that I was working in an environment where we were all men. It was completely normal for me to see that we were working in an environment where we had to draw on the family's resources because we didn't know very much about their children, and we simply assumed that the families knew more about their children than we did. And we also had a mission. We were all kind of left-wingy social workers. So it was obvious for us that the work that we were setting up in this early childhood program had very much to do with emancipatory practice. We were reading Freire at the time. We were also interested in ideas of the French educator Célestin Freinet. And we were reading authors from the Russian tradition that are that you rarely find in the Western debate. So we were interested in works of Makarenko, for instance, and his wonderful practices and ideas and models he actually set up in terms of group pedagogy. So this whole idea of working with groups, working in the community and working closely with families who are the first contact and the experts about on their children. That was my first formative experience in early childhood. And it was only later that I discovered that I had got myself into an extremely gendered field, into a field that quite often sees itself as being detached from any political questions or political realities, as a field that sees itself concerned with children and their development in a rather universal way, as described and predicted by developmental theories, and I found myself at odds with this new field I discovered. And this feeling of unease is actually what kept me going throughout my professional career. And it's this feeling of unease in early childhood as something that I see as deeply embedded in the social, economic, historical and political realities of this world.
In my role as a professional development person, in my work I worked with teachers in services centres in New Zealand, and because I believe that when we're working with teachers and we're facilitating, you teach who you are. So that belief, I think it transmits in terms of authenticity, because I believe what I'm doing, I believe in what I'm saying, and I think that that's kind of honoured. People can feel that that honesty in what you're bringing to them. So I think that facilitates openness and responsiveness back to oneself, and you build on that process. It's about sharing that and being that.
What do you think, Jenny?
Well, I think because my kind of, my whole purpose in my work has been to create a better world. I'm out there to make a difference in people's lives and to, give people that I teach and work with some understandings that enable them to join that struggle. It's about, it's a transformative struggle, and it's about, undoing some of the harm that is still being, often inadvertently, unconsciously inflicted on children on a daily basis, children and families and people, and creating, trauma that is very hard for people to shift out of. So I think we have to actually use my view about theory is that we have to be really eclectic, and we have to have a repertoire of theoretical tools that can give us different lenses to even analyse one situation. We can look at a particular situation and we can apply a particular tool. For example, a child who has an obsession with a particular play, maybe, and we can say, well, that child is obsessive compulsive. That child, that's using a particular lens. Or we can turn it around. We can say, wow, that child is just so passionate. She has such an interest in what she's doing. She is really involved and engaged. Look at the learning that's happening when that child is exploring and extending her play in this one particular area. So we can try to theorise from a range of different lenses, and that will actually shift the way we see that child engaging in her space and claiming her space and constructing herself in ways which are much more enriching than if we decide, okay, I've labelled that child. I've got her nailed now. I understand theoretically this is what tells me what I need to do now. I need to control this child because I've understood that she's out of control. There's different ways that our theories can be applied in ways which can be very dangerous for children and very narrowing, or they can be very opening to the possibilities that child can reach.
And in the process of decolonising, in some of the professional development work alongside teachers, it's been really important to articulate a Māori world with clarity and to invite people into your world. And so when teachers get a deeper sense, a deeper connectedness to who you are and what sits around you behind that Māori child, they start to connect in a different way. And in one centre, they actually developed the harakeke, the flax, as a metaphor for their centre. And a child 4 years old, whose nanny was a harakeke expert, started to talk to them about, oh, my nana does that. She takes the harakeke, she gets a mussel shot and she scrapes it. And they learned all this information about harakeke that they had no knowledge of. She was the teacher, they were the students. And they acknowledged that they didn't know this. But and I was thinking, how in Aotearoa would you not know something like this? But they actually were learning from that child. And because they actually introduced that to the child, she felt she had a place to talk from within herself back to that. So that decolonising is critical to helping people shift their lenses.
And another way that the theory can actually help us become aware of the theories that we are operating from anyway without being critically conscious of them. So I think that everybody has a theory, whether it's overt or covert, many theories that they're operating under. And so a theoretical purpose is to deconstruct the theories that we were unconsciously operating on and critique our practice, because practice is not just practice. Practice is actually a praxis of the beliefs that we bring to that practice. And so I'm reminded of what David Ingleby wrote many years ago. He wrote that theory creates its own truth. So if we do, for example, believe that children are egocentric and they are impossible, it's impossible to encourage them to share because they're really not ready, then when are we going to teach them to share?
Here's a quote from Foucault that I think challenges us to see the power of regulation. Foucault says, "Truth isn't outside power. Truth is a thing of this world, and it induces regular effects of power. Each society has its regime of truth, its general politics of truth. That is, the types of discourse which it accepts and makes function as true, the mechanisms and instances which enable one to distinguish true and false statements, the means by which each is sanctioned, the techniques and procedures accorded value in the acquisition of truth, the status of those who are charged with saying what counts as true." Now that might seem quite overwhelming to you. There's a lot of words there, but in essence what I take Foucault to mean by that is that in today's society, truth is a really strong form of power. We have a regulatory environment. Regulations don't smack us, in the face physically. They don't pose a physical danger. But the power that regulations carry is much more subtle and implicit. Okay, so truth about regulation. So for example, with the national quality standards, if you are operating at a national quality level, therefore you are said to be providing a quality service for children and for families. Currently we have a system of regulation and accreditation. The truth around accreditation is that if your centre is accredited, then your centre is a quality service. Now we know from experience, from people talking in the field, we know that that's not actually the case. So what Foucault is talking about is questioning truth judgments, okay? Another truth in early childhood is that a quality centre is that which enhances children's developmental outcomes. I have absolutely no problem with that. Of course, in a quality centre, we want to optimise children's outcomes. So their physical development, their cognition, their socio-behavioural development. Absolutely, that's a fundamental part of what we do. But we often don't talk about quality in terms of social justice, quality in terms of social inclusion. Why is it that regulatory documents, even in the national quality standards, there's very little discussion of those aspects? So why is it that we have a truth about quality being about developmental outcomes and not about social inclusion? How might your practice and what you do in your centre be different? So that's what Foucault is talking about, looking at taken for granted truths that are presented to you in regulatory documents, in media releases from politicians, and questioning the assumptions that underpin them. Foucault in that quote also talks about who has the power to say what counts is true and who doesn't. And I think we might agree that unfortunately early childhood educators have limited power in terms of what they can say is important to and fundamental to the provision of quality. So that's what Foucault is talking about. He challenges us to see the power that lies in truths, and by unpacking the assumptions of those truths, we have the beginnings to work on what he talks about, our acts of resistance.
I'm still surprised to see that early childhood educators in the many contexts that I meet them in many different countries, as well as early childhood lecturers, preparing future educators at colleges and universities, see themselves as focusing on the child only, which is quite often an image of a universal child, which has little to do with the real children that they are working with. And I find myself even more surprised to see that they conceive themselves as working in a reality that has nothing to do with the social, political, historical realities of the children that they are working with. And let's face it, with the quite often stark inequalities and injustices in this world. So coming from a critical perspective, which when I started working with young children, I wasn't aware that it was a critical perspective because it was the only one available. And coming from a perspective that sees early childhood practice as a deeply political practice, I'm trying to understand how early childhood professionalism can be conceived and can be conceptualized in a way that reflects these realities. And talking to practitioners in many of our projects, I can see that there's a huge challenge because regardless of their institutional setting, level of formal qualification, the places and organizations in which they work, we always come across an interesting dilemma that these practitioners report to us in these projects. On the one hand, most of these people we're talking to are very aware of the uncertain and risky nature of their practice, of their day-to-day practice with young children. They crucially depend on relationships they build with the families and the communities. They crucially depend on interactions with the children and the parents and the communities. They know that whatever they do in their classroom, in their program, in their setting, is only one part of the story, and that the children and the parents and the community contribute as much as they do to this thing we call education. And on the other hand, they face expectations from the outside world in a way that make them feel they have to present themselves as the know-it-alls, as the experts for what they are doing.
One of the things I like about Foucault's work is that he doesn't leave us in the lurch. He talks about challenging existing truths, but he doesn't keep us hanging. Foucault talks about power in a very different way to the thinking that those in government have power, we down here in centres have no power, or adults have power, children have no power. Foucault's work disrupts that line of thinking. And I'll just read a quote to illustrate that point. Power must be understood in the first instance as the multiplicity of force relations immanent in the sphere in which they operate and which constitute their own organisation. Where there is power, there is resistance. I love that quote. As you can see, I'm very attached. Why I like that is because I think thinking about regulation, and certainly with my doctoral work, I visited some centres and talked to a lot of educators about how they engaged with the regulatory environment. For some, regulation was very much an imposition of power. Okay, the regulatory body says this, we must do this, therefore that is absolutely what we will do. Okay, so you know, if you have someone from community services come out and say, no, you need to develop a checklist that marks off how many times you've checked the centre that day for hazards, you might go off and do that. What Foucault says is by thinking about power differently, it gives us and gives you as educators freedom to resist and to practice in ways that are more integral and consistent with your own personal philosophy and with your vision for the kind of society and the kind of centre you want to have for young children. So what Foucault talks about in that, I know it was another lengthy quote in terms of multiplicity of force relations. What Foucault is talking about is that power is fluid. Power can be disrupted by multiple relations. So for example, the relationships you have with your colleagues or with your management group or with parents at your centre can impact how you engage and respond to required regulations. So for example, in my study, a lot of, I don't know how many times it was that I heard stories about climbing, that we can't let children climb above a certain height, or we need to get rid of mirrors because they pose a danger to children. What some centres did was they were very proactive in working with parents and even advisors from community services. They worked very hard in articulating and promoting their centre philosophy and their vision for what they wanted their centre to be like. They talked about how they saw children as capable and how they wanted to foster that in their practice. They talked about how they had above regulatory staff-child ratios so that the supervision was an important factor in ensuring children's safety. But not in terms of the number of staff. The extra staff on board was really useful in terms of developing relationships of mutual respect, of collaboration. And that's why you can have a situation where you might have glass mirrors, but you have a situation where you are confident that that's not an unsafe environment for children. So it's thinking those things through in your practice that mean you are able to challenge or resist what may otherwise be perceived as a top-down imposition of particular standards that you may not necessarily agree with.
At the University of Western Sydney, I've been working with a group of colleagues theorising a concept that we've called robust hope. We're a group of academics, teacher educators, that work in very different areas. One of my colleagues works in transnational knowledge flows, another in special education, another in gifted education, another in technology and education, but another in secondary English. We were united by a shared concern around delivering justice to the disadvantaged and the marginalised, and thinking about how education contributes to making that happen. So we began reading around hope, and there are many different theories now that are around hope, but what we worked out was that a lot of those theories were very naive. So they conceptualised hope as a kind of waiting for things to get better, rather than having an activist dimension. We were interested in exploring how an activist dimension might be inserted in a reconceptualisation of hope, and we came up with the idea of robust hope. So we borrowed from the idea of robust care to bring that idea to the fore, because that was care that's multidimensional. So this is hope that's multidimensional, and it's hope that involves those to whom you're trying to offer hope, whereas a naive hope tends to be offered by those from above, if you like. So it requires an engagement in the community, and it requires a commitment to democratic practice. And this is where we encountered the work of Henry Giraud, who very helpfully for my work has theorised democracy in very powerful ways. In my other work, I was working on the effects of corporatisation on the early childhood field, and Giraud's work around democracy as the market was particularly useful. But Giraud's work contributed to our theory of robust hope by helping us work around the ideas of how to engage, if you like, the oppressed or the disadvantaged into democratic communities of practice. Other key concepts of robust hope include resilience, and we borrowed from some of the psychological perspectives on resilience and reworked the concept to include a sociological perspective. The concept of robust hope then has activist dimensions. It embraces the idea of interdependence, and it attempts to create reciprocal communities of practice characterised by trust and reciprocity. We're hoping that robust hope will be a powerful tool that people can use when engaging in education policy making and education practice to test the validity or test the robustness of their intentions and their outcomes. I think it's got a great deal to offer theorising leadership. If leadership can't offer a form of robust hope to those that they're working with and for, then leadership has failed.